My mother, tell you a quick story. Used to teach the visually impaired, and so I was acutely aware of some of the limitations and opportunities that they had, and this wouldn't be one of them. So, my name is Jordan French. I'm the executive editor and founder of Grit Daily News, a news outlet based in York, covers brands and all sorts of interesting technology, especially how we interact with the world. With me is Henrik Landgren with EQT Ventures. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can you hear me?
You're doing great.
Thank you. Likewise.
I'm tempted to take these off, though.
Let's see.
I'm going to try it and not go too far.
Okay, maybe I sit here.
You have a seat, I'll sit after you as a courtesy.
Okay.
And I feel like I'm wandering outside of a Shark Tank when you're Shark Tank. And there's sharks swimming outside, the shark cage.
Yep.
And you wander outside. That's this feeling right now. We are outside of the shark cage.
Right, and the audience is the sharks.
Swimming with the sharks.
All right, interesting.
That's how this feels.
Yeah? They don't look that dangerous, I have to say.
They're a bit toothy today. But I have you with me for what I think is actually a really, really interesting and exciting topic. We're going to talk about Motherbrain, something that EQT Ventures is up to. I like to liken it to, just for a brief overview, for those who are familiar with the Moneyball concept as it relates to baseball, for the longest time, to explain it, baseball selected its players by scouts. These usually elder men would go out to baseball fields and smaller teams and just look at the players and watch them throw. They, as you could imagine, were pretty biased and look for things that weren't necessarily, it turns out, the best way to play baseball. Along came a team in the late 90s, the Oakland A's. They were losing. They had small budget. If there's an analogy here, we'll get to it. And ultimately became a very winning team based off of data. That's a wonderful segue for what you're doing at EQT. But for some foundation and the uninitiated out there, Henrik, I'd like you to share some of your earlier adventures before we even get to Motherbrain. Yep. So if you will.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I should just present myself. I'm Henrik Landgren. I'm one of the operational partners at EQT Ventures, where I focus on everything data, algorithms and AI and things like that. So I have a quite technical background. I started coding when I was a kid, and then I worked as a developer for some years during the golden .com era. Then I realized that I'm not going to be the best programmer out there, so I went to school to learn more of the business side of things.
But I'll interrupt you right there, because
sure.
I want to lay out the facts for everyone in the audience. That's your opinion, not necessarily true. In fact, you were involved in the best of something.
You mean as a developer?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right.
Don't sell yourself short.
Okay. Yeah. If you so I was working as a developer as I was a kid, and then I continued to do that on my free time. And then after high school, I worked as a developer full time, and we built many things. But I worked as a consultant at the time. We built some platforms. Such as one was the world's best internet radio station, if that's what you're referring to, I think.
Yeah, I am.
But the thing is that there was awarded the best internet radio station at the time of year 2000 with 10,000 users or something. So it's a little bit too early versus today.
Right, like I said, don't sell yourself short. But that said, with radio, you in some ways continued that career at Spotify.
Yes. So after going to school, after going to McKinsey for some years, I then came back to tech and music when I got the opportunity to join Spotify in 2010.
And what were you doing in that role?
So first of all, I was hired to help the founding team to general decision support or project leading. Basically, my knowledge or experience from McKinsey, together with the tech side, was a good fit for them to help them to elevate their decision making. Spotify was a great tech founding team, super good developers, but they didn't have much experience at that time in the more business side of things. So my background was very handy at the time. Then very quickly we realized that to make better decisions, you have to, of course, you collect data and you do some kind of structured analysis to what the options are, and you try to be as smart as possible. And at Spotify, we didn't have that data, so very quickly my job changed to be the person leading the task to build the analytics platform. So we built up the tech platform and together with the developers, and then also adding the analytics team into that could actually make sense of that data.
So just to paint a picture here, this is inside Spotify's app. You have a lot of users on it. They're all interacting, doing all sorts of things, and the data is there. It was always there, but you're in charge of sort of identifying and capturing what was there.
So the new thing at that time, so think back to 2010 now, the whole thing with big data was just in the very emerging times. So the technology that allowed us to actually store not just the high-level numbers of how many users you have, but actually this every single event to like what every user did. So every click someone did, that could be stored on that level, and it could also be analyzed. And that was the new thing. So what I did and what we did was to figure out, okay, what if we now build an analytics team trying to make better decisions across all of the organization when we have all this data available? And that was a new thing for us, a new thing for the world at that time. So we, together with other four leading companies in this field, were kind of developing at that time how you work when you have all that data available. Because one of the biggest challenges is not to drown when you have that.
Yeah, and certainly I think let's expand on this point before we get to EQT just a bit. And that is a lot of the audience might be thinking the same thing. Perhaps in 2010 there weren't so many tools. While we established the data is there weren't so many tools to sort of start to analyze. Now it seems that there's perhaps a sea of different tools to analyze audience. It sounds like a lot of noise in this sense. How can you explain, what perhaps they should be looking for or should be using based off your experiences just at Spotify?
Yeah, exactly. At that time, there weren't any tools. All the tools were built for the previous paradigm when you didn't have that much data. So we had to create many of those tools for when we kind of discovered how we wanted to use this. Nowadays, there are, as you said, like an ocean of tools to collect data, to analyze data, to create dashboards and things. And that the technology nowadays is not the problem. The challenge that founders have, and I say now this as in my role at EQT Ventures, when I meet with founders, is to how can we work in a data-driven way. Some companies and some founders, they don't have any data at all, so they ask a lot of questions on what should they do to collect this data. Some have way too much data, or they have a lot of data and a lot of different tools, and they're really proud, and they show us all the dashboards and things they have, but they're like still they don't see, they can't make sense out of that, so they're getting paralyzed by this data. So I think the real key is to figure out how can we work in a very business-oriented way with this data, in a very disciplined way. So figuring out what makes sense, how can we define the key figures, the key numbers, the key metrics to really track that actually make sense for our business. And the beauty now is that you can actually define this based on the very, very raw level of detail. And this was impossible before, because in the past, pre-big data and pre-2010, you were limited to only be able to define metrics in like the highest level of dimensions, like you could fit in a spreadsheet. But now you can actually define the specific metrics that really, really matters for you, that is important for you, so that you track what you do in the right way.
Certainly, and that speaks to perhaps somewhat internal audience data. Perhaps some in the audience even have applications like Spotify or their own customer base or customer audience where they have native or somewhat captive data, but it seems a bit of a leap to go external, outside, in what seems like a very complicated decision-making process, and that is identifying good investment opportunities for what is really a very narrow point in the business life cycle. To clarify, when you invest is typically around Series A, somewhat early, not too much later. What makes you think it's as simple as adopting a data set and analyzing it, perhaps through an algorithm, and magically spitting out what's investable?
So now you mean for us as investors?
Right, at EQT.
EQT Ventures, yeah. At EQT Ventures, I'm kind of trying actually to do what I did at Spotify, trying to figure out how can we use data to make our investment process better. So if we just start with that, and then think about it, the first natural thing that comes to mind is, okay, what do we do today as people, as investment professionals? When we look at a company, what do we look for? What kind of data sets do we analyze regardless? And what analysis do we do to make up our mind if we're interested in a company or not? And then say, okay, all these things that we do today, let's make sure that we make a platform that has all those data sets in the one place. And then let's make sure that we, as people, can make that analysis as fast as possible.
And you had to start somewhere, though. There were some inputs. What were the few initial inputs that you thought were so important and said, these are the things that our algorithm absolutely needs to measure?
Yeah, so that's the ongoing work. So you have to start somewhere, right? And so, for example, we started with adding performance data, so traction data, such as web traffic, such as App Store ranking data. Those are like probably the most obvious ones. So if a company is growing, that's probably a good sign of something is going on here. And then we started to add more and more things. So we have financial data, we had like investor data. We go in and add, for each company, we go in and look at their websites to get the text information from the websites, to also add that into the mix, because that helps us to understand, even before we look at companies, are these in sectors that we tend to like or are they not? So the whole point, what we're trying to do is if we can collect as much data as possible about the companies, we can make us faster when doing the assessments, which means that we can look at more companies. And then we can also use the same data sets to probably predict what we will like as well. So that comes as a bonus. And that makes us then hopefully spend the time on the more promising companies and reduce the time we spend on the less promising companies.
Right, and so for the audience, everyone has on their mind, how is this working out so far?
We've been at this. So EQT Ventures is a new fund, so we're 3.5 years old, and the first generation of Motherbrain was actually built before the team was there, so it's 4 years old. And during these years, it's been evolving, of course. And nowadays, we use Motherbrain for everything we do, to help us to find companies, to help us be structured in when we assess them, to help us build relationship with the right companies. All of those things. So we use it for like everything we do. So in that sense, it's like super successful. We also then attribute some companies we say this company, this investment came solely from Motherbrain flagging it to us. And so far, we've done 5 of those investments out of around 50.
So that's a small number, and the natural next question to ask is, if you're going to nearly bet the farm on this tool, you must have supported it with something. So there's data out there. While you can't predict the future, you could always look backwards. Did you have a chance to do that, and what were your results?
Yeah, so that's a very common question. Can you backtest the model to see, would you have found these companies in the past if you would have had this model? And we obviously do that too. And yes, we would have found all the unicorns, if you will, for example, last year, if we would have had this when we started the fund. We've done such tests. But to me, that question is a little bit strange, because if you train your algorithms based on history, it would be strange if you couldn't predict the history. So if I couldn't do that, then I think something would have been very strange. So another way to look at this instead would be, of the actual rounds that happens ongoing, how many, like in the markets, we track that. So of all the investment rounds that happens right now, every month, we see how many of those did Motherbrain flag to us before. So do we have a scene rate of Motherbrain, and how high is that? And we see roughly that it's around 80% of the transactions that happens right now, Motherbrain has already flagged to us. So that's a very nice sign for us that we're onto something.
Certainly, it sounds promising. Let's set that aside for just a moment, and we'll inspect the algorithm next. But on everyone's mind too, we've mentioned this term, Motherbrain, that we use to describe the tool. What's behind the name?
Yeah, that's a very catchy name. It was decided before I joined, and It comes from, I think the people who picked the name said it came from a video game from the 80s. So it's in one of the games from the 80s. It's a character called Motherbrain, and that's the name. But I think it's a very catchy name, and it really encapsulates what we're doing. So I think it's a good one.
Was befitting of a team that is invested in at least one gaming company. If you could share with the audience, they're also wondering. You mentioned 5 investments. Can you just share 1 or 2 of those so we have an idea? We can test you later in a few years to see how Motherbrain's doing.
Exactly. Yeah, you should do that. So the first company we invested in was a German company called AnyDesk, and that's a remote desktop application. Super strong tech team that had created this fantastic product that was growing like crazy. We reached out and invested in them. And since then, they've continued to grow. So they work really well. They're one of the top performing companies so far. Another one is a gaming studio in Ireland, which we invested in even before they released their game, and still haven't released yet. So they're in the building phase right now. So let's see how that goes. Super exciting too.
And that one was called
War Ducks.
War Ducks.
War Ducks. Yeah. And the last, or the latest investment, not the last, I hope. The latest investment is a company called Standard Cognition, which is a US SF-based company who does what Amazon Go does with checkout-less grocery stores. They create that technology, but for the rest of the companies. So you have cameras in the ceiling, and then with deep learning algorithms, they can figure out who takes what, and then you can just walk out and payments are being handled.
Certainly. No, I just have 2 more questions, and then we'll definitely turn to Slido. I know there were questions for Henrik before we even started. One I'll marry to the top-ranked question so far. They're asking about criteria, but I know you volunteered one to me. I'll share that I found interesting, and it is actually prior investment in companies. And the reason why I think we want to explore that is we all know generally a lot of the data that's reported out there is investors are biased. And in some cases that discriminates against potential founders based off of gender or sexual preference or what have you. Well, so it begs the question, if you're pulling in perhaps some dirty, messy, or otherwise already obscured biased data,
yep,
and then infecting your own results based off of that feedback loop,
yep,
is there a solution there?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think by looking at actual facts and not just having looking at the companies that screen the most or that knows the right people send to you, we're reducing a lot of the bias because we get a much more objective view of which companies are actually performing versus not. So in general, I think we're getting a more objective view of the world that helps us. But then, for sure, we are training. If we're building models that we're training on historic behaviors, and also that we're training based on our the people that we have in the team's judgment, we're building that into the model. So we're, in one sense, training the model with our collective biases in the market and in us as a team. So that's a danger. But one could say that that also helps us to make better investments, but also introduces us to bias, which means that we will most likely miss opportunities that are more outlier type of investments, both when it comes to like diversity, but also other factors as well. So like new emerging sectors, if no one has invested in a new sector, well, we might not see that if you just take the base principle. But since we know this and we can control this, so that's the cool thing here. That if we build this, the algorithm together, we build like the norm. So we get the sense of this is the assessment based on the norm of the collective market and the team together, and then we can control from that. Say now we want to explicitly over-index on certain geographies or certain aspects of the market, or just focus in and dial in explicitly on the demographies that would help us to fight those biases.
Certainly, and I have to ask the question, it's a bit meta for me. Since Motherbrain looks at investment opportunities, if Motherbrain or its algorithm equivalent was a startup with a prototype, would Motherbrain first find and then flag for investment itself?
Yeah, that's a funny question. And it's funny because it sometimes flags companies to the team that are like kind of Motherbrain-ish, because it's a generic platform we're building. It could be applied in other industries as well. And it's sometimes they tend to like those kind of companies to us, and I do think they are interesting. So companies that do what we're doing, I think could become really good platforms, because I think you can build this into a generic product. So definitely it has already flagged some companies to us like that, and we're looking into them.
Certainly a fascinating subject. We could spend, I'm sure, at least another hour on it.
Days.
Perhaps days. Love to hear and watch and see Motherbrain weigh in the next time on stage. You are the Paul Podesta is to the Oakland A's as you are to EQT Ventures. This is all the time we have. Give a round of applause to Henrik Landgren, EQT Ventures, for joining us. We know he's a busy man.
Thank you.
I'm Jordan French, Scritzeli. Until next time.